I'm James Lawler, and you're listening to Climate Now. In the United States, there has been a frustrating lack of major climate action at the federal level. I wanted to get a sense of why that might be by speaking with someone who knows their way around Washington. Ideally, someone who's had a front row seat, observing how policies do and don't move through our government's machinery. We met Alex McDonough. Now, Alex may not call himself a Washington insider, but he worked for 11 years under Senate Majority Leader Harry Reid, first as legislative counsel, and then as a senior policy advisor for energy and the environment. Alex was also the vice president of public policy at the residential solar company Sunrun, and is now a policy advisor and partner at Pioneer Public Affairs, which is a clean energy lobbying firm. Alex is also a co-founder and board member of Clean Energy for America, which advocates for policies and leaders who champion the clean energy workforce. Alex, welcome to Climate Now. It's great to have you.
Thank you. It's so great to be here.
So Alex, give us a little bit of backstory. How did you get to where you are today?
So this clean energy climate policy is not what I set out to do. After college, I worked for an international judicial reform organization in Uzbekistan and Kazakhstan under a government contract. And really, I didn't fall into energy policy or environmental policy until I came back to the US and was lucky enough to get hired by Senator Harry Reid. I was offered a tremendous opportunity to work on environmental policy, which he had made a huge priority for Nevada, which was extraordinarily brave at the time. He made it about climate, but he also made it about environmental justice and what pollution from coal-fired power plants was doing to nearby communities.
Interesting. What exactly does a senior policy advisor do? Like working for someone like Harry Reid, what does that entail?
A policy advisor's role is to try to see things through the eyes of their principal. In my case, Senator Reid. I would do everything from meet with stakeholders, meet with constituents from Nevada, meet with affected industries, and formulate how he should respond. Sometimes that response could be a public statement. Sometimes that response is introducing legislation. Sometimes that response is stopping legislation. The policy advisor's role is being a jack of all trades, not being a total expert at anything, but knowing how to get information, how to compile it, and how to make good recommendations to your principal.
In your view, what is the role of the federal government when it comes to climate?
The role of government is to act in the public interest, to serve public welfare, keep us safe and secure. And climate change is the biggest threat we face in terms of environmental security, health, and even national security. It's actually quite simple. Like if we are to do something economy-wide, to address climate change, we can't do it without the federal government engaging. There are a lot of different ways that they can engage. They can engage through a tax policy, through a carbon tax. They can engage through a cap and trade. They can engage through incentives like we're doing in Buildback Better. There are different ways that can happen. We can address climate change if they are not engaging in some way.
Now, obviously, there's been a lot of news lately about climate policy in the United States and the lack thereof. I'm thinking about Buildback Better, for example, which is yet to be passed. And I wonder if you could talk about how a firm like yours, Pioneer Public Affairs, interacts with legislators who are formulating and negotiating something as huge as Buildback Better, also known as the Budget Reconciliation Bill.
The folks we work for play different roles in this whole ecosystem, right? We do work with some environmental organizations, and their goal is the big picture. Their bigger mission is to make sure the whole thing gets across the finish line. So, we will help with developing a strategy, developing a message, figuring out, how to work with congressional offices or, influential voices out there to say, let's get this done. But then there are others that are, trying to weigh in directly on the policy, and a big portion of the Build Back Better clean energy and climate provisions is in the tax code. So there's just a large number of tax credits and a lot of industries affected. And so companies and organizations are watching these and weighing in on, from their view, improvements. And so we will advise them on what is practical, what is Congress likely to accept, what the administration might view as good policy and actually go to bat for and say, yeah, that should be included.
You've worked so closely with a lot of these policies and you have a specific expertise in solar energy. What could Build Back Better do for solar in particular?
I worked in the solar industry for 4 years, and I think what's in the Build Back Better bill is a game changer for the whole industry, not just in terms of continuing fueling deployment. Solar is only 3% of power on the grid today. So people, look at the cost compared to natural gas and say, oh, it's the cheapest power out there. But 3% is not much in the grand scheme of things. We need to address climate change. That's the end goal. That's why we're doing this. And so, the Build Back Better would give a 10-year runway for tax incentives, but it would also provide new tax credits for domestic manufacturing, which is incredible. There are a couple new big factories that have cropped up in the US over the last few years, but not enough to sustain the industry today, let alone the enormous amount of growth that's needed to hit that 40% that the Biden administration and Department of Energy have forecast that solar needs to reach in order to address climate change, hit the targets that they've set out to reduce 50% of our emissions by 2030.
How does that trickle down into the economy when a target like that is set? What actually happens?
Yeah, I mean, for the first time ever, are we seeing things in legislation that have a good chance of passing that could really bring that domestic manufacturing into the United States and make that happen? But what you see in very concrete ways is you see investors, big investment firms, start, getting a better grasp of what the lay of the land of is in the industry. They're reaching out directly to industry players, whether they be on the policy side, but also on the development side, and just boosting their understanding. And so, like, I get a ping a week by, these investment firms asking to talk about, various aspects of policy and industry. But then you also see like manufacturing companies starting to announce that if legislation passes, we will do X. Or sometimes they don't even tie it to the legislation. They say we have plans for a gigawatt manufacturing facility in the Midwest. And they dangle it out there because they want the policymakers to see, oh, this is real. And if we do X, then that can materialize. And so we're in the world that I work in, we're seeing those happen in real time.
And can you explain why there has been such a focus on tax credits when it comes to climate policy?
If I was looking at the entire toolkit, would I say tax policy is the best way to do climate policy? Probably not, given the procedural restrictions that Congress is under. The Senate in particular has to pass legislation that fits within the budget framework in order to have a majority threshold. And it is very clear that there isn't the Republican support to do major climate legislation today. So under those constraints, tax policy is very attractive because it has a proven track record. The wind industry and solar industry have been, more or less built on the production tax credit and investment tax credit. The fact that Build Back Better, the engine of the climate policy in that legislation is in the tax code, isn't a surprise. You have, everything from incentives for existing relatively mature technologies like solar and wind, but then you also have incentives for emerging technologies like hydrogen and carbon capture, standalone storage technologies. There's a new tax credit for transmission. There are incentives that are tailored for deploying solar on low income communities and on multifamily housing. There are adders. The tax credits are tied to paying prevailing wage and hiring a minimum threshold of apprentices, which is, really important for bringing more people into the trades building these clean energy facilities. It's incredibly comprehensive what they've put together by way of tax policy in the legislation.
When you think about these levers for job creation in the Build Back Better bill, why do you think more Republicans haven't shown support for legislation connected to climate change? If you thought about how to do that in a smart way, make it about jobs, make it about international competitiveness, but do it as a Republican and be out in front and say that you're for it, why does that not work?
I think you have Republicans who are supportive of acting on climate. They know what's happening, but the environment is so politically charged that it's just politically dangerous for them to, you know, align with Democrats, especially when they're using an approach that only requires Democratic votes to pass. They might favor different policy approaches to it, pulling in a lot of research that's been done that shows that incentives and investments in clean energy, especially emerging technologies, but even solar and batteries, has tremendous bipartisan support. But while we have Democratic control of the White House and Congress, I think you're going to see the focus be on getting the solution, getting as much done as possible in the window that they have.
I wonder if we could take a half step back here. Could you tell us a little bit about what the landscape looks like today for clean energy and where the fault lines are? Not just with Build Back Better, but more broadly. Who is coming to the table and what are their messages right now?
It's actually incredible. Like, we're at a time when everybody is basically at the table. Nobody is standing on the sidelines. When I started working on clean energy and environmental policy for Senator Reid in the 2000s, this ecosystem didn't exist. There weren't really many clean energy companies. There was no industry really to be had. And now you have some incredibly successful companies. You have, quite effective trade associations, and you have a lot of collaboration between folks in the industry and the environmental community because everybody's kind of united on the end goal of addressing climate change.
And if you were to imagine a pie chart which represents the total amount of money that's funding kind of pro clean energy, pro climate, policy, how does that break down?
I don't know if I could do the math at the top of my head, but there are environmental organizations who are going all in on addressing climate change. Trade associations are putting a fair amount into it. But what I think really is the differentiation here is that you have, so many different companies and entities jumping in, and you have more of like a grassroots network and that people power. You mentioned at the top of the show that I was a board member of Clean Energy for America, which was the outgrowth of an effort, Clean Energy for Biden, which, helped organize the clean energy workforce into an advocacy machine in which, we were able to connect people using, virtual online tools and regular phone calls or Zoom calls to organize everything from, fundraisers, get out the vote effort. People put together policy recommendations for the transition team. And it just really tapped into, what is turning into hundreds of thousands of people in the clean energy space and who have skin in the game and want to see it succeed, whether it be because it's the place they work or they work there because they want to address climate change. They're getting involved directly, personally at that level.
The fossil fuel industry has had such significant power. Is it still a David versus Goliath situation where you've got a more grassroots kind of coalition up against these large corporations? Or is it becoming more of a fair dollar for dollar match?
It is not a fair dollar to dollar match. I think I'd rather look at it as a million Davids versus Goliath.
Okay. Well, it only took one David, right? With so that's a fairly optimistic description. I am sort of struck by like a general note of optimism in the way you're talking about this, because I think from an audience that's sitting outside of DC, we're struck by kind of a doom and gloom narrative about how hard it's been to pass this legislation. But I'm not really hearing that from how you're describing the situation. Is that fair, or how do you see it?
I don't know how I could do this job or get through my days if I was not optimistic. But I mean, I also try to zoom out and put this in perspective of the system is not designed to allow things to happen easily. Now, when there's a crisis, it feels like everything comes together, and we see that with things like the COVID crisis. Things lined up pretty quickly in order to get at least the first aid package done. I've worked on other policies that have taken much longer to finish.
What are some examples of that, just for context for people? How does it compare from a timeline perspective to other legislative efforts?
I'm going to choose one that is quite parochial, but like for Senator Reid, he cared a lot about public lands policy. And I spent years working to put together land bills, negotiate on the local level. Then you get them to Congress and go and hunt down your bipartisan support, get everybody in the Nevada delegation on board in order to pass a 30,000 acre conservation area. It's done once you do it. So it's worth the effort, but it takes a lot of time and a lot of blood, sweat, tears, a lot of compromises. You end up giving up a lot in order to get to a point where you have people in agreement, but then you have something and it's durable because everybody's agreed. That's the process we're in. It's not unusual. It's frustrating because we have seen a lot carved out of the legislation, and we will probably see more carved out of it before it's ultimately passed. But that's the process, and that's the Senate.
One policy that we've talked a lot about at Climate Now, we've made a number of video about and had other conversations about, is just a price on carbon. And there seems to be fairly widespread agreement among scientists and economists that this is the best way to decarbonize. Why can't we pass a carbon price?
The simple answer is it doesn't have the votes. It doesn't have the political support that it needs to pass. Otherwise, it would be included in Buildback Better, potentially. There is a group of senators that were working on it, and I imagine they continue working on it because there will be life after Buildback Better. I think that yes, it would be better if we had a price on carbon. It would be better if we had a national policy on to address emissions. I don't think it's completely off the table. There's even bipartisan legislation that was introduced in the House. There are a number of Republicans, former members of Congress, and organizations that are working on developing conservative support for a price on carbon. I think that while it might not be there today in some form, it'll happen. They need to get the political support to make that happen. I think that the benefits of doing a price on carbon are there, well available, but sometimes politics is a funny thing and it doesn't track exactly what the reports tell you they should.
What policies are you seeing that will help transition the American workforce from a fossil fuel-based economy to a renewable energy economy?
I'm pretty focused on the Build Back Better effort right now because it's here now in front of us, and the biggest climate policy that Congress has taken up. That's going to lead to construction jobs and jobs throughout the clean energy sector. There are incentives included in there to source domestically manufactured content. The buying domestic equipment is tied to a program called Direct Pay, which allows you to take the tax credits as cash rather than having to go to a bank to finance them, to monetize them. That is tied to buying domestic equipment and using that for your facilities. There's also a bonus incentive for domestically produced material, and then there are specific tax credits for manufacturing offshore wind, solar, semiconductors. All those things create big job opportunities and will require that the clean energy workforce just dramatically increase in size. But then there are also some interesting provisions that are helpful for building that workforce. There's a requirement for, if you take the full value of the tax credits, whether it's, you're building a solar facility, wind facility, hydrogen, carbon capture and storage facility, in order to get the full value of that credit, not only do you have to pay prevailing wage, but you'll also have to hire a minimum threshold of apprentices to be on site of your project. And that will create new opportunities for new entrants into these industries. As an example of how seriously the industries are taking it, I work with the Solar Industries Association to do a roundtable with a IBEW union, so basically electrician apprenticeship training facility in Las Vegas. And the focus on that was let's discuss what you do and how you do it, and what your training tools are, but also, you know, to make sure that they saw the solar industry reaching out and recognizing, one, we have this requirement, but two, we're going to need this workforce, this skilled workforce available, and we want to start collaborating with you right now to have that relationship so that we can hit the ground running as soon as these incentives pass.
Wow, so you're saying that's already been happening. So solar companies are reaching out to this group to build this relationship, to build a pipeline of apprentices.
Yeah, we did that roundtable in, I believe, early November, and we had Senator Catherine Cortez Masto participated in it. Several other members of Congress and local officials joined for parts of the discussion, gave supportive remarks, but the real purpose of that was to have that substantive discussion, make those connections between solar industry and the apprentice training folks from the union.
Alex, I just wanted to end with this because I think in general, lobbying tends to have a negative connotation. In the public imagination, we kind of see it as this conniving backroom wheeling and dealing, convincing legislators to do things against public interest. As a lobbyist yourself, what do you think of that characterization?
Look, lobbying is important to democracy. I'm not saying that there aren't bad actors. I'm not saying that there aren't industry and interests that, put hundreds of millions of dollars lobbying and trying to influence government for causes that I oppose and don't like. But I think the blanket stigmatization of lobbyists and lobbying has gone too far. Our government is enormous and complex and can be inaccessible even for folks who run companies or run nonprofit organizations or are elected officials for local governments. Do we expect everyone to just be able to access this complicated machine on their own? I mean, I think that we stigmatize people who represent those folks and kind of lump them in with the bad actors or the causes that we disagree with. But I think we also need to keep in mind that there are people who lobby and work for public interest causes. They work on social welfare issues. They work on human rights, healthcare access, clean water, and many other things. And do we really want to imagine what laws Congress would pass without those folks? Do I think all lobbyists are good? No, but I do think that it plays an important role and has been a big part of advancing a lot of good causes.
That was Alex McDonough, Energy and Environmental Policy Advisor and Partner at Pioneer Public Affairs. That's it for this episode of the podcast. You can check out our other interviews, watch our videos, and sign up for our newsletter at climatenow.com. And if you want to get in touch, email us at contact@climatenow.com or tweet us at WeAreClimateNow. We hope you'll join us for our next conversation.